Hey, everybody. My name is Josh Linville. I'm the Vice President of the Fertilizer Division for StoneX Financial Inc. FCM Division. So, what are some of the watch points that I'm doing right now? I'm not going to dive in deep. This is the first video. I more want to just cover the overall of the marketplace. So, starting with nitrogen, one of the biggest things that we've been watching is this whole Israel, Hamas, and frankly, Middle East conflict that's been going on. Now, if you guys are familiar with it, take a look at this map. Those three countries over to the left, that's North Africa, and everything to the east is the Middle East. This is a map of all the urea exports that come from each of the nations around here. Now, those countries to the west, when you look at Algeria, Libya, Egypt, now they are not really in the mix of this war that's going on between Israel and Hamas. But they're close enough that some of their input prices, natural gas, have been impacted. We've seen some of their costs go up. We've seen some of their production that has been impacted because of what's going on there. But the bigger problem that we have, the biggest thing that we're worried about, you've probably heard a lot about the Houthi rebels attacking ships in the Red Sea, and that was hurtful. You know, that one ship that sank, that was a fertilizer ship coming from the Saudi Arabia, and that made everybody decide to go elsewhere. That was impactful, but there was other ways around. If you were heading west, all you had to do was send your ship down south around Africa, and you could go that way. Yeah, it's more time. Yeah, it's more freight, but you could get it there. The thing that scares me on this map is look over here in this little corridor. That's, in case you don't know, this is the Persian Gulf and this is the Strait of Hormuz. And those of you old enough to be around and remember the news back when we were in Desert Storm, a lot of the fear in the marketplace was that this whole corridor was going to see vessel traffic shut down. And the big fear was oil. All this oil came through the Persian Gulf, through the Strait of Hormuz, out to sea and out to the North America, everywhere else around the world, and we were scared it was going to stop. Well, Iraq has this tiny little bit of land that touches the Persian Gulf. But what have we been hearing about in the news here recently? It's been Iran. We had a little tit for tat between Israel and Iran, and there's a lot of threats and there's a lot of fear that this whole thing is going to blow up. And the reason why we need to be worried is that if Iraq was able to influence the oil market because of the fear of losing Persian Gulf traffic, look at what Iran is. They control the entire eastern and northern seaboard of the Persian Gulf. Think about how much easier it would be for them to start influencing traffic, attacking ships, things like that. This is the worry. And when you look at this map, when you look at North Africa and you look at the Middle East, guys, 1 out of every 2 tons of urea exported around the world comes from this little piece of land. If all of a sudden we see this entire system or this entire region start to blow up, which it seems like everybody's stepped back, everybody's calmed down, but it's still a tinderbox. And I don't want this to happen. I hope this is a story we never have to discuss. But if this starts to happen, guys, we're talking almost half of every ton of urea in the world all of a sudden is in danger of getting shut down or impacted in some way. So these events that happen halfway around the world, they seem like they're forever away. We don't have to worry about it. It's no big deal. Guys, we have to watch the world. We are part, I don't care where you farm. You are part of a world market, whether you like it or not. The second place we're watching is China. Now, take a look at this. This is the top 10 global exporters in 2022. And China's in the top 10. They're number 9. And you might be thinking, well, that's not really that big of a deal, Josh. The problem is in 2022, they exported about 2.8 million ton. Normally, they would export between 5 to 5.5 million. They are the third largest exporter in the world when normal. But the problem is, the last several years, what have we been dealing with? High global nitrogen prices and tight inventories. Well, the Chinese government stepped in and said, well, we know that we export quite a bit. We don't want to lose everything. We want our farmers to have cheap prices and adequate supplies. So they've been putting restrictions on those exports. That's helped to keep prices high. Imagine what happens. Now, all of a sudden, global urea prices are kind of getting back down. They're not low enough. Trust me, they could go lower, but we're finally seeing prices down and we're finally seeing inventories be sufficient. If all of a sudden we see China come back and they go from 2.8 back to 5, 5.5, that's a lot of tons in the world looking for a new home. That's a very bearish situation. So we got to watch China. Number 3 is Russia. And when you look at them, urea, UAN, anhydrous, before their invasion of Ukraine, they were the number 1 exporter of all 3 products in the world. Phosphate, they're the 4th biggest exporter in the world. Potash, they were number 2. And when we got to these sky high prices back in 2022, when we thought we were losing Russia, that's why we spiked so high. Everybody was scared to death that all the nations around the world were going to say, Russia, I can't believe what you're doing. That's terrible. It's a travesty. You're killing innocent people. We're done. We saw Starbucks pulling out. We saw McDonald's. We saw all these companies pulling out of Russia, and it very quickly became apparent we need to be worried that we're going to lose Russian fertilizer. And that would have been devastating on a scale that we couldn't even begin to imagine. And that's why we saw these prices skyrocket. Now, fortunately, that never happened. And in fact, when you look at urea, UAN, phosphate, and potash, they have actually beaten their 3-year average here last year or two. They've actually been exporting more. Anhydrous, they are cut off. I'm going to cover that here in a second. But just to give you a sense, that's a little bit of why we saw the prices jump up like they did. And it's still something we need to watch. It's not as though the Russian-Ukraine situation is done. It sounds as though the Russian military has amassed about 500,000 troops. They're putting them on the border, getting ready for another summer offensive. Guys, this thing is not done. It's not as though this thing has gone away. It's just kind of moved on in the news cycle. We need to watch it because if all of a sudden this starts to ramp up again, it could have real world implications on global fertilizers. And talking about the anhydrous side, so this is a map of Ukraine. And Russia, what they would normally do, and again, I'm hoping you can see my cursor here, they would produce up here within their own territories, within Russia. And they would ship it in through a pipeline, much like what we have here in the US. They'd ship it down through this pipeline through eastern, southeastern Ukraine, and out through that Odessa region. And they load on vessels and send it out to the world. And they would normally export about 5 million tons a year that way. How many tons do you think that Ukraine is allowing Russia, the country actively invading them and attacking them, to flow through that pipeline? If you said 0, that's right. They shut down this pipeline, whether it was because the Russians controlled the territory and it was a war zone, because the Russians were pushed back and all of a sudden they started to attack the electrical grid and all the pumps started to shut down. You have to have pumps over that course of miles. Regardless, we lost Russian anhydrous to the tune of 5 million tons a year. This has been a major, major event. Now, Russia is continuing to work on a new port that's east of Crimea. We're expecting that thing to come back online here sometime in 2024, but you never know. I mean, it's close enough that Ukraine could definitely attack it if they felt like, or they could bring this plant online and it never gets touched. Again, these world events are going to have impacts here. And then Europe. I'm going to show this just because I get a lot of folks who sit there and say, well, Josh, my natural gas price in my country is what's setting the world price. And for a lot of places, and again, I'm going to take it from a North America standpoint, that's not correct. And the reason is Europe, when they started to oppose the Nord Stream pipeline, of course, opposed Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what did we see happen? Russia cut off natural gas flows through the Nord Stream to Europe. Prices skyrocketed. And take a look at this graph. That the Dutch TTF, that green line, that is the European natural gas price. That red line is your NOLA. That's a New Orleans, Louisiana urea price weekly. And that blue line down there, that's your Henry Hub. That's your US North America price. So just take a quick glance at that. Which one is driving the boat as far as pricing goes? There's a lot more correlation to that Dutch TTF, that European, because European has become our high cost producer in the world because they have lost that natural flow of natural gas. So when people wonder, well, why did my price change? Nothing changed here. Natural gas price here in the US hasn't changed at all. It's because it's not being set by anything in the US based. All the Henry Hub means is how much or how little manufacturers are making. This thing is largely being driven by what European economics are. Again, world events. On the phosphate side, I want to point out, I show this graph because it points out just how narrow of scope the phosphate market is. And you look at this graph, 5 countries control the vast majority of exports around the world: Morocco, China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the US. So it's a very, as big as a market as phosphate is, it's very small in terms of who produces and who exports. So who we're watching, number 1 is China. Now, they're number 2 in 2023, but the only reason they're number 2 is because, again, the government is restricting exports. They are typically the world's largest DAP MAP exporter and producer in the world. And it's decently above Morocco. But again, world prices went sky high, inventories got tight, so they shut down exports. That helped to keep Chinese domestic prices low, and it made sure there was adequate supply in the marketplace for their own people. So they've reduced it, and they are still the second biggest in the world. But we have seen signs that China was going to come back, but then we've started to see some weakness in the world pricing. So all of a sudden there's talk that over the next 30, 45 days, they're going to shut down production, make repairs. That will help buoy price ideas. It's kind of all over the place. And it really comes down to what is China going to do or not going to do. That's how important they are on the phosphate market. And here in the US, something that we learned here a few weeks ago is over the last several years, back in the summer of 2020, a North American manufacturer asked for countervailing duty rates against Morocco and Russia because of unfair trade practices. They would later win that. And so it meant that we lost Morocco. They had duties against them. They are the number one exporter in the world as of 2023. China, number two, already had duties against them back from the Trump era. And then Russia was number four, new duties on them. So countries number one, two, and four on that export list had duties and made it very difficult to come to the US marketplace. All that did was leave US production and basically Saudi Arabia to come to the US and service our needs. And when you look back at this chart, again, look at this chart. Look at how far it falls, going from number 5 US down to number 6 Jordan, and then Australia at number 7. So people sit there and say, well, it's fine. We blocked these 3 countries. Why don't we get it from everywhere else? Guys, in the world of phosphate, there's not a lot of everywhere else. So this is something that's going to continue to kind of keep this thing stalled out a little bit. It's going to keep it elevated. In potash, potash has become a very, very quiet marketplace, and that's fantastic. Finally, we have some steady somewhere. Values fell off significantly from their highs. They have reestablished themselves. And again, I'm looking at it from a New Orleans, Louisiana perspective, but we finally gotten down around 300. It's just stayed steady. It reset and it stayed there when all the other fertilizer prices went back up higher. We don't expect a whole lot of volatility in that price. It's just something the manufacturers have done a fantastic job of making sure it stays connected to where the grains, where the farmers need it. It's remained a very attractive product. But I will say longer term, and this is looking years, this is not months, this is a years type situation. We do think that potash is going to be one of the best supplied fertilizers in the world. There's new production coming online in Canada. There's new production expected in Russia. China continues to invest in Laos, which a neighbor of theirs, which would give them a local nearby neighbor supply of potash and disconnect themselves from somebody like Canada. So we think the potash is going to continue to stay very non-volatile. We think it's going to stay fairly flat priced. Anything can change. Everything usually does change, but that's something to keep an eye on. Otherwise, one of the things we'll talk about going forward is we do things a little bit different as far as where we think value is. We look at things at a ratio approach rather than a flat price approach. And the reason for that is farming, in my mind, from a very, very simplistic point of view, it's just inputs and outputs. You are raising bushels or tons, whatever it is, to pay for your inputs. And you want to spend as few bushels as humanly possible. So we look at it in terms of that. How many bushels are being spent, in this case, per pound per ton of fertilizer? With the idea is, regardless of the price of either one, the less bushels we spend, the more bushels we keep to sell at a profit. So we'll get into that some of the other videos as we go along, but I just wanted to touch on that so we can hit on it next time. Otherwise, guys, like I said, just first video. We'll see if it passes the smell test internally, if we get this sent out there. If you get a chance, if you're on Twitter, try to put stuff out there daily through the week. You can find me at jlinvillefert. Of course, visit stonex.com to find me if you need to reach out. But guys, really appreciate it. If you have any ideas on what we can do to improve this or got any commentary or anything like that, please reach out and let me know. Otherwise, appreciate it. We'll see you.